Well, Western New York, Buffalo, North Towns, South Towns, this has been a quote-unquote off-season that was one that we did not envision for our Buffalo Sabres. What's happening, everybody? I'm Ryan Thomas. Thank you so much for tuning in to this special audio edition of the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. Whether you find your podcasts on Apple, whether you find your podcasts on Spotify, Google Podcasts, I know that I have a large contingency of listeners that love to listen to podcasts on their drive into work, whether they're at the gym, whether they drive while they work. I know some Uber drivers. I know some Lyft drivers. I know some Door Dashers. I greatly love being able to provide entertainment to any of my viewers or listeners throughout any walk of their life. And I'm really happy to be adding more audio content brought to you, of course, by the Thomas Take Sports Podcast and, of course, sponsored by 26shirts.com. For all of your Buffalo Bills gear, Sabres, or just Buffalo gear in general, go to 26shirts.com and contribute to the community with each purchase of each product that they sell. So with that being said, diving into this Buffalo Sabres offseason, of course, been very active on X at Ryan Thomas Take, giving you my take on all things Sabres this offseason. Sabres general manager Kevin Adams shopped the 11th overall pick, used that shopping spree as a movement to move down in the draft. Rather than trading the pick away, the Buffalo Sabres moved down from the 11th overall pick to the 14th overall pick. San Jose Sharks, Mike Greer, they move up from 11 to 14. Buffalo then shops the 14th overall pick to the entire National Hockey League, and they were unable to get any offers. No team was willing to make an offer to Buffalo that was worth to their liking, worth what they were asking for, or what they viewed as worth that pick. So Buffalo, with that 14th overall pick, they take Konsta Helenius. And I want to start off by saying first and foremost that Konsta Helenius is a good player. I like the pick a lot. I think that he will be in the NHL within a year, potentially at most two. Most talent evaluators, most scouts that I trust believe that Konsta Helenius is one of the best Finnish hockey prospects of the last 20 years. And they viewed him as a potential top 7 player in this draft, and yet the Buffalo Sabres were able to draft Konsta Helenius with the 14th overall pick. It's another year where a very good player falls to the Buffalo Sabres, luckily, in the top 15. And the same thing happened last season with Zach Benson. He falls to Buffalo in the top 11, where he was listed as a top 5 player in his own right. And he goes on to play valuable minutes as an 18-year-old kid for the Buffalo Sabres, which was a big ask of him, and he delivered. He was pretty good despite being undersized, underage, and playing in a league among men as a boy, as a 18-year-old kid. So I think that this is where I want to start. I know that this is where I wanted to start this podcast and talking about Konsta Helenius as somebody that is an offensive, creative player, a player that can create scoring chances, a player that can go end-to-end with the puck virtually on his own with moves that can dazzle. And he's a fast player. He's a quick player, quick decision, playmaking type player that the Sabres at center really need in the future. I see him as a potential third or second line guy that the Sabres can really embrace and bring in when the time is right. So I want to start off with that because there's going to be a lot of negative talking points, or what are going to be perceived as negative talking points throughout my time on this podcast today. But I want to start with acknowledging that they tried to trade the 11th overall pick in a move to get a top 6 forward. They were unable to do that. They tried to trade the 14th overall pick once they traded down from 11 to 14 to get a top 6 forward. They were unable to do that. They then tried to trade with any team for a top 6 forward, whether it was trading their first-round pick in next year's draft or getting a package of players together, whether it's Henry Jokiharju and a prospect for a player that is considered a quote-unquote top 6 forward, and they were unable to do that. Now, this offseason, every team knows where every team is at. Salary cap-wise, competitively, the state of the franchise of each franchise within the National Hockey League is different than the next. Each one has a different level. They're in tiers, though. Some are champions like the Panthers. Some are contenders like the Oilers and the Vegas Golden Knights and the Rangers. Some are outliers to the playoffs, and some are bottom 10. The Buffalo Sabres, from 2022 and 2023's 1 point away from making the playoff season to the 2023-2024 20 points out of the playoff season, they, safe to say, regressed. And they made a very big and very important decision to go from Donnie Granato back to Lindy Ruff. And again, I want to say that was the move that kind of set the tone for what type of offseason that this was going to be. Bringing back a coach like Lindy Ruff is not a move that is a light move. That's a very serious change in the competitive nature of the Buffalo Sabres. We know that better than anybody because we know what Lindy Ruff brings to the table, what he demands out of his team, what he's able to pull out of his team, whether it was the Sabres, whether it was the Stars, whether it was the Devils. Even in his time as an assistant coach with the New York Rangers, he has been praised as a coach that is able to pull a lot out of his players, get more out of less, work more with less, do better with less, and do great with more. And that was the 05, 06, 06, 07 Buffalo Sabres in a nutshell. So, as well as the 99 Sabres that made it to the Stanley Cup final game, 6, I believe, I believe it was game 6, Brett Hall, all that bull crap. So, of course, Lindy Ruff was going to get an opportunity again to not only coach this team, but to put his fingerprints on any new additions. And yes, there is a need to have new additions to this franchise. Definitely. Across the board. Whether it's, you could categorize it as top 6, you could categorize it as top 9, you could categorize it as bottom 6, you could categorize it as top 3. To me, when I look at this team, there is a lot of skill. There is Tage Thompson. There is Alex Tuck. There are players on this team that I think highly of, like guys like Jordan Greenway, who have not really shown what they're fully capable of yet, but they're physical marvels. Jordan Greenway's ability to move, to check with his size and strength, few guys have that ability. He could be one of the biggest, to use a basketball term here, he could be one of the biggest and baddest power forwards in the National Hockey League. But when he's playing on a line that does not complement that, outside of Tuck and Thompson, I don't think he's going to produce. And when you put together, the off-season lines, if you will, when you put together how this team is supposed to look, when you put together on paper what this represents as far as the Buffalo Sabres goes, I'll go over this with you. The Buffalo Sabres have remade their fourth line. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. Guys like Kyle Okposo, obviously gone. Zemgus Girgensons yesterday signs a 3-year, $850,000 per year deal with the Tampa Bay Lightning. He's gone, right? And Victor Olofsson is gone. So Buffalo gets Beckman Lenston. They trade a second-round draft choice to the Washington Capitals for Beckman Lenston, who is looked at as one of the most feared players in the game with his ability to hit. He is a body checker. He is a guy that puts the lumber down. He lowers the shoulder, pun intended, like Brian Campbell did on R.J. Umberger. You guys remember that? Then you have another new addition in Nicholas Abe-Kubel of the Washington Capitals. This guy is also known to lay down the lumber, but he's fast, he's feisty, he's competitive, he plays end to end, and he has a game that is tenacious. Kind of looking at a guy like Zach Benson, as I mentioned, 18, but very tenacious. He's a puck-stealing, takeaway style player, just like Zach Benson and Nicholas Abe-Kubel. So, not a bad addition. And then Sam Lafferty signed to a 2-year deal with $2.2 million, listed as the centerman of the fourth line. Now, this is where things get interesting. I'm not denying that there is a realistic chance that Buffalo's fourth line with these three guys is much better than what it was a year ago. It's an improvement over Zemgus. It's an improvement over Okposo at that stage of his career. And Victor Olofsson has been as good as gone. They've destroyed his trade value over the course of the last 2 years, telling everyone and their mother that Victor Olofsson is a goner. So this is where things get into the negative territory for me as a Sabres fan. So I love Jeff Skinner. I really enjoyed Jeff Skinner on the Buffalo Sabres. I don't look at Jeff Skinner as a guy that is an analytical nightmare like most of these analytical guys do. I know what he is, I know who he is, and I know why he is what he is in terms of a hockey player. He is an offensive first, second, third hockey player. There is not much defensive tenacity to his game. He's a guy that creates chances. He's a guy that tries to get open on passes. He's a guy that tries to feed the puck to the net. And for a team that ranked 23rd in the National Hockey League in goals for, Jeff Skinner was a big part of that pie that made up the very abysmal goals for statistics of the 2023-2024 Buffalo Sabres. Yes, Jeff Skinner, a veteran of the National Hockey League, has had fantastic seasons where he's scored 40 goals, where he's scored 30 goals, where he's scored 25 goals, and he's had years where he's scored 14. That is an NHL career. That is what makes up the majority of players within the National Hockey League. Not every single player in the National Hockey League can be Connor McDavid, can be Sidney Crosby, can be Nathan McKinnon, can be Leon Draisaitl, can be Alexander Ovechkin. Not every player is going to do that, especially when you are thrown into complete and total chaos from a coaching standpoint within the Buffalo Sabres organization in the last 13 years. Jeff Skinner, a Buffalo Sabre for the last 6, and played for how many different coaches? 4, 5? I've lost count. I honestly couldn't give you an accurate representation of that because of the fact that this team has changed coaches so much. I've lost track as to how many and as to when, to be quite fair. I do remember 2018, Jeff Skinner scored 40 goals and was one of the best forwards in the National Hockey League. I do remember 2022-23, Jeff Skinner, Alex Tuch, and Tage Thompson were one of the best lines in the National Hockey League from a production standpoint across the three players, of course, playing on one line. But then Skinner tapered off. And a lot of that, I think, had to do with Donnie Granato. A lot of that had to do with the injuries of Tage Thompson. A lot of that had to do with the moving and shaking that has been this youth movement, trying to figure out who deserves more minutes on the youth side, whether it's Peterka, whether it's Quinn, whether it's Benson. And Skinner fell victim to that. I think wrongfully. Jeff Skinner, Alex Tuch, and Tage Thompson, that line should have been left utterly alone, no matter what. No matter what, that line should have been left alone, and it wasn't. So Buffalo makes the decision to buy out Jeff Skinner. I've been on my podcast, I've been on my Instagram stories, I've been on Facebook, I've been talking about why that was a mistake, why they shouldn't have done it, why they should have waited another year. I don't want to go into the mumbo-jumbo of all the numbers. I don't want to bore you guys with that. But if they would have waited a year, he's another year in, they know who he is, they know what he brings to the table, and to put it mildly, it's another year where they're paying him $9 million, yes, but it's another year off of a buyout potentially, where they're only paying him on a buyout for 5 years rather than 6. I have a hard time wrapping my head around how Jeff Skinner couldn't have been traded. I have a hard time, especially now that Jeff Skinner was bought out, especially now that Jeff Skinner is an Edmonton Oiler for 1 year and $3 million. I have a very hard time wrapping my head around that. I think Buffalo could have sent him packing, could have traded him away to another team, could have assumed some of his money, whether it's $4 million, whether it's $5 million, and that would have been a decent move. Better move than buying him out. You're only paying 4, you're only paying 5 over 3 years rather than paying that spread out money over a span of 6 years. Granted, buying out Jeff Skinner added almost $7 million to Buffalo's salary cap for this offseason. So when they make this decision, I'm thinking to myself, okay, they're adding $7 million. They're going to be able to go out, and if they want to spend that $7 million on one player, they could do that. If they want to go out and get a Chandler Stevenson, or they want to go out and get a Pat Kane, if they want to go out and get an Anthony Duclair, they could do that. Not by paying $7 million to Duclair, not by paying $7 million to Stevenson, maybe paying $7 million to Patty Kane to bring him home. And he's one of the best, if not the best American skater of all time in the National Hockey League. So, at least of this generation. So, I would have said, okay, fine, great. Instead, Buffalo goes out and they sign Jason Zucker to be a member of this team on a 1-year deal for $5 million. And to me, I haven't heard Jason Zucker's name in about 3 years. I remember Jason Zucker when he was on the Penguins. I remember Jason Zucker when he was on the Minnesota Wild. And looking at Jason Zucker's Pro Hockey Reference page, I guess you could say, Jason Zucker had 69 games played last season with 32 points. So I'm not seeing great statistical production outside of 22-23 with 27 goals, 48 points with Pittsburgh. I'm not seeing consistent production since 2017, 2018, and 2019 between his time with Minnesota and then in his last season traded from Minnesota to Pittsburgh. Remember, plenty of years in Minnesota, in particular, his age 25, 26, 27 season where he was productive. 22, 33, 21 goals. Is that Jeff Skinner's replacement? It appears as if it is. And I don't see that as an improvement. Maybe from a defensive standpoint, maybe from a toughness standpoint, but from an offensive standpoint, I can't see how Jason Zucker is better than Jeff Skinner. I just can't. As well, the contract. 1 year, $5 million. And this reeks of a 1-year contract where the player plays for the Buffalo Sabres from October to February, and he's traded to a contender at the trade deadline as the Sabres are abysmal. This is just a rental. Or he plays really, really well, and they're able to bring him back, but do they want to bring a player back that could be taking more time away from the younger guys like Kulik and Rosine and guys like that in their near future. I don't understand where they are at in terms of where they believe where they're at. Do they believe that they're a playoff team? Do they believe that this is the year that they should and can make the playoffs? Do they really believe that? If so, then this was not the way to approach the offseason. This was not the way to build this roster. Building your fourth line is one thing. That's separate. That's bottom six. We're talking top six here. It was not the way to build the top six by adding Jason Zucker, in my opinion, and letting go of Jeff Skinner. So I haven't even gone through the lines, so to speak, yet. Jason Zucker is listed as a third-line guy. He's not a top six forward. He's a top 9 forward. Jason Zucker, Peyton Krebs, and Jordan Greenway. Now, that line might be okay. I like Peyton Krebs. I think there's a lot more to his game than what he has shown. I don't even think he's touched his full potential just yet, but I've seen glimpses of it. I've seen enough glimpses of it to know that there's something there, something that made the Vegas Golden Knights believe in him as a first-round draft choice, and something that made Kevin Adams include him in a monumental change or trade, sending Jack Eichel to Vegas for a first-rounder, Alex Tuch, and Peyton Krebs. That was not a bad trade in the slightest. And then I like Greenway. I think Greenway can be a good third-line guy. Great fourth-line guy, but good third-line guy. And then the second line, you have the young line. A very green and a very young line that is led by Dylan Cousins, who I think is a workhorse, the workhorse from Whitehorse. I've seen this guy will his way to the net so many times over the course of his short career in Buffalo, but I will say that last season was a very down season for him. And if they're expecting him to be their second-line center and play valuable minutes and score 25 to 30 goals, this is the year that if he doesn't do that, the Weiner line of WGR will be clamoring for his exit, just like they have with a lot of other players over the years. And let's be honest, it's part of the reason why those players are not even on the Sabres anymore. The Victor Olofssons, the Sam Reinharts, the Jeff Skinners. Sam Reinhart was lazy. Jeff Skinner was selfish. Jeff Skinner was a one-dimensional player. Victor Olofsson, he just has a shot. That shot was pretty good. He scored 25 goals a year with that shot. And last I checked in hockey, you need to be able to score goals to win games. In the playoffs especially. So, yeah, defense can win championships, but you need guys that can score goals. And right now, the only 3 guys that I look at as realistic players that can score goals on this team are Thompson, Tuch, and Cousins. Now, the young line is Zach Benson, Dylan Cousins, and Jack Quinn. Jack Quinn was irrelevant last season. He could not stay healthy. He had multiple devastating injuries, and they're counting on him at the age of 19 or 20 to be their second-line right winger. It's a lot to ask. First line, J.J. Peterka. Again, another player that they expect to take a massive step forward, that took a big step forward last season. They expect him to take another. They're asking a lot out of their young players. They want their young players to get minutes. They want their young players to get time, opportunity, and they expect their young players to be volatile enough to be those guys. Or dynamic enough. I said volatile, but dynamic enough. You get my point. Peterka, Thompson, Tuch. Thompson and Tuch easily 2 first-line guys. They're real NHL caliber players. Easy first-line players on the Sabres. Tuck is probably a second-line player anywhere else. I hate to say that because I love him, but don't think he's a first-line guy on half the teams in the league, I guess I could say. Thompson is definitely a first-line center. He's primed and ready to be that. But these moves have done nothing to show that they're going to be a playoff team. These moves have done nothing to prove that they are competitors in the National Hockey League, that they are relevant in the National Hockey League. If anything, it's proven that they have a very green GM that other teams are not as willing to trade with, only when they feel that they're getting the better end of the deal. And that would be the case in point of Buffalo's trade with Colorado, where they traded Casey Middlestat to Colorado for Bowen Byram. Now, I actually think that was an even trade, but I think Colorado looked at it as, oh my God, they're willing to give up a true second-line center for a defenseman that, yes, he's highly projected, but he hasn't shown that. And at the time, Casey Middlestat was arguably the best forward on the Sabres roster when they decided to move him. They moved him on a high. They knew that the high was not any higher than at any point than that in his tenure as a Sabre. So they move on from him. And that's just business. But at the same time, that's the type of situation we're facing here with Kevin Adams as the general manager of the Buffalo Sabres. And it's very easy to be critical. But it's very hard to be critical with substance. But Kevin Adams makes it easy to be critical of him with substance. When perception is reality in this case, you have a GM that is a green GM. He's only been doing it for about 3.5, 4 years. And he cannot make these barn burner moves that most GMs can make. He does not have the pull. He does not have the negotiating power or tactic to be able to pull that off. As well, from a free agent standpoint, National Hockey League free agent standpoint, you've got all this cap space and then some with the buyout of Jeff Skinner, and you use it on 3 fourth-line guys and Jason Zucker? There are plenty of quality forwards in this free agent period. They didn't want to marry themselves to a bad contract for the fear of another Jeff Skinner contract. So basically what I'm saying to you guys is that this organization lives in fear of making a mistake. How are you supposed to step forward from a mistake if you're still in fear of making a mistake? And yeah, some of these contracts in NHL free agency, they're egregious. They're ridiculous. They're a joke. Chandler Stevenson got a 7-year contract with Seattle. Should not have gotten 7 years. But the idea that the Sabres would be able to attract a Steve Stamkos or a Marchessault or a Pat Kane even, it's a fantasy land. None of those players are willing to come here. None of those players are willing to commit years of their career to coming to a team that has been an absolute cluster, you know what, for the last 13 years. I'm hopeful. I try to stay hopeful. I love this team. I would love nothing more than to see the Buffalo Sabres playing playoff hockey once again. I really hope that it can happen this year, or at the very least sometime soon. But it's trending in a direction that on paper I don't have much confidence in the Sabres making the playoffs this year with the additions that they've made thus far. But I'd love nothing more. I love going to games. I will find myself at KeyBank Center I've found myself at KeyBank Center a lot over the last 4 years since COVID. I tried to get back into the rhythm of going to events, going to games, and they were a big part of that. And I liked a lot of the players that they had in 21, 22, 23. They had a great season. I was all on board for the Jack Eichel trade when most Sabres fans were not. I loved the return. I'm a huge Alex Tuch fan, huge Tage Thompson fan, and Dylan Cousins. Those are their three best players, with the exception of their defense and Rasmus Dahlin, of course. Bowen Byram is a stud. Owen Power, I think there's plenty of reason to be optimistic about Owen Power. I've heard enough of people knocking Owen Power. He's extremely young, and I think he's going to be great in the National Hockey League. All those guys, Dahlin, Thompson, Tuch, Cousins. Dahlin, Thompson, Tuch, Cousins, and there was another one that I failed to mention. But those few, I'll just go with those few. They're all locked up. They're all under contract, which is great for the Sabres. That's great that they're ahead of the game in that regard. Money committed to them. Those players are great players. But saying we need more from those guys, or we expect them to be more, you need to surround them with more. This is not enough. Tage Thompson playing with J.J. Peterka, that's not what should be happening right now. Dylan Cousins playing with Jack Quinn and Zach Benson, no, that's not what Dylan Cousins needs right now. They need veteran players. Tage Thompson needs veteran winger. Cousins needs veteran wingers. And Jason Zucker is not enough. So I hope sincerely that the Sabres are not quote-unquote done, because if they aren't done this offseason, then they'll be done in the regular season, and a lot of their fans will be done with them as well. And I'm not saying one of them will be me, but I completely understand the frustration. The frustration has more than boiled over. It has been long enough. The point of playing a sport is to win. They've undergone multiple tanks. They've had the first 7 years of Jack Eichel's career wasted, and a lot of that has to do with the organization, and some of that has to do with his lack of leadership ability, his lack of maturity as a terrible captain. I've talked about that for years. It's the reason he's not a captain in Vegas now, and that is one of them, one of many. So you hope that Lindy Ruff can right the ship and get these guys on the right track, get their heads out of their asses, get them above their playing potential. Turn potential into reality. Turn potential into win. Turn promise into results. And that's what we're hoping for. And if there's any coach out there that we want to do it, it's Lindy Ruff. Every Sabres fan loves Lindy Ruff. And they knew that. That's why they brought him back. So we'd love to see Lindy. What a story it would be to see Lindy Ruff come back, bring the Sabres back to the playoffs, bring the Sabres back to relevancy. That would be enough. I'm Ryan Thomas. Again, thank you so much for tuning into this audio episode of the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. Last and certainly not least, let's go Buffalo. I will be in attendance for some games. I love the Sabres. I don't want that to be falling on deaf ears. I want this team to succeed, but they're not doing the things necessary to succeed, in my humble opinion. And that's the beauty of this podcast and many others, is that we can share that. Thank you.